The musty basement of Sarah's childhood home felt different now, heavier somehow, as she sorted through decades of her mother's belongings. 8 months pregnant and exhausted, she almost missed the scratches in the concrete floor, deliberate marks forming a perfect rectangle beneath boxes of Christmas decorations. Her mother had always warned her to stay out of the basement, claiming it wasn't safe for children. But Sarah wasn't a child anymore. When she pried open the hidden hatch, the smell hit her first. Decay mixed with something chemical, something wrong. The narrow ladder descended into complete darkness, but it was the sound that made her blood freeze, a faint whimpering, like an animal in pain. Sarah had spent 10 years as a crime scene investigator before her pregnancy, and she recognized that smell. Death. But the whimpering meant something was still alive down there. Her mother had died 3 weeks ago, taking her secrets to the grave, or so Sarah thought. Now, with her baby kicking frantically inside her, Sarah faced an impossible choice: walk away and call the police, or descend into the darkness to face whatever her mother had kept hidden for decades. But what if she was already too late to save whoever was trapped below? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the hatch, her forensic training warring with maternal instinct. Every protocol she'd learned screamed at her to secure the scene and call for backup. But those protocols assumed she wasn't 8 months pregnant in her dead mother's basement, discovering what appeared to be a hidden chamber. The whimpering came again, weaker this time. Human, definitely human. She pulled out her phone. No signal. The thick stone foundation of the 1920s house had always been a dead zone for cell service. Her car was parked outside, a 5-minute walk to reach help. But 5 minutes might be too long. Sarah lowered herself to her knees, ignoring the sharp protest from her swollen belly. She peered into the darkness, straining to see anything below. The chemical smell grew stronger, medicinal yet putrid, like a hospital mixed with a morgue. "Hello?" she called down softly. "I'm here to help." Silence. Then a rustling sound like fabric against stone. Her mother's old camping flashlight sat on the workbench across the basement. Sarah hauled herself up, moving as quickly as her pregnancy allowed. The beam was weak but sufficient to illuminate the opening. The ladder descended about 8 feet into what appeared to be a rectangular chamber carved directly from the bedrock. The professional part of her mind catalogued details automatically. The ladder's rungs showed wear patterns indicating regular use over years. The edges of the opening were smooth, reinforced with concrete. This wasn't hastily constructed. Someone had planned this carefully, built it to last. As she aimed the light downward, Sarah's breath caught. The chamber was larger than it had appeared from above, extending beyond the flashlight's reach. She could make out what looked like a metal table, gleaming dully in the weak light. Cables and tubes snaked across the floor like technological vines. Her baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp. As if sensing her rising panic, Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. The whimpering resumed, definitely coming from the far end of the chamber. Sarah thought she glimpsed movement in the shadows, a pale shape shifting against the darkness. "I'm coming down," she announced, though every instinct screamed against it. She couldn't live with herself if someone died because she chose caution over action. The descent was awkward with her belly, each rung a careful negotiation between balance and urgency. The smell intensified with every foot. Formaldehyde, she realized with growing horror, and beneath it, the unmistakable sweet stench of decomposition. Her feet touched solid ground. The chamber stretched further than she'd expected, disappearing beyond the flashlight's weak circle. The floor felt smooth, almost polished, with drainage channels cut into the stone that led to a central grate. Sarah swept the light across her immediate surroundings and immediately wished she hadn't. The metal table wasn't a table at all. It was an examination chair, complete with leather restraints worn smooth from use. Medical equipment lined shelves built into the rock walls, surgical tools, bottles filled with amber liquid, and devices she couldn't identify but that filled her with primitive dread. The whimpering was closer now, somewhere to her left. Sarah forced herself to move toward the sound, each step revealing new horrors. Glass containers lined another wall, their contents obscured by age and darkness. She didn't want to look closer. "Where are you?" she whispered, sweeping the light in wider arcs. The beam caught something that made her stumble backward. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a cage, large enough for a person, constructed from heavy metal bars that looked disturbingly well maintained. The whimpering was coming from inside it. Sarah's training had prepared her for crime scenes, for human depravity in all its forms. But nothing had prepared her for the possibility that her own mother, the woman who had raised her, who had baked cookies and braided her hair, might have been capable of this. Her baby kicked again, frantically, as if trying to push her away from whatever truth awaited in that cage. The morning light filtered through the dusty curtains of Sarah's childhood bedroom, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor she'd walked on countless times as a girl. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with grief and the overwhelming task ahead. 3 days, that's all the time she had before the estate sale, before strangers would come to pick through the remnants of her mother's life. Sarah pressed her palm against her still, flat stomach, a gesture that had become second nature since learning about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago. She hadn't even told her mother yet when the stroke happened. Now she never would. Downstairs, the house felt larger somehow, as if her mother's absence had created a vacuum that made every room echo. Sarah started in the kitchen, methodically wrapping dishes in newspaper and placing them in cardboard boxes. Keep, donate, sell. 3 simple categories that felt impossibly cruel when applied to a lifetime of memories. By noon, she'd filled 6 boxes and worked up a considerable sweat. The house's ancient air conditioning had given up years ago, and opening windows only seemed to trap the humid August air inside. She decided to tackle the basement next, hoping the underground space would offer some relief from the heat. The basement had always been her mother's domain, a cluttered workspace where she'd spent hours on various projects, sewing machines, craft supplies, and towers of storage boxes created a maze that Sarah navigated carefully, conscious of protecting the small life growing inside her. She was sorting through a box of Christmas decorations when she heard it, a hollow thud beneath her feet that seemed different from the usual solid sound of her footsteps on concrete. Sarah paused, listening. When she shifted her weight, the sound repeated. Kneeling, she ran her hands across the floor. Most of the basement was bare concrete, but this section was covered by a large, faded rug that she remembered from the living room years ago. She'd always wondered why her mother had moved it down here. Sarah pulled back the rug's edge, revealing wooden planks instead of concrete. Her heart began to beat faster. A trapdoor? In all her years living in this house, she'd never known it existed. The wooden square was about 4 feet wide, with a small metal ring embedded in one corner. Years of dust and grime had settled into the cracks between the planks, suggesting it hadn't been opened in a long time. But as Sarah brushed away the debris, she could see scratches around the edges, signs that it had been used, and used often. She grasped the metal ring and pulled. The door was heavier than expected, and the hinges protested with a low groan that seemed to echo up from whatever lay beneath. A musty smell wafted up, earth and something else, something that made her stomach turn. She attributed the nausea to morning sickness, but even as she thought it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Darkness yawned below, absolute and impenetrable. Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, her hands trembling slightly. When the beam cut through the blackness, it revealed wooden steps leading down into what appeared to be a small room carved out of the earth itself. The rational part of her mind urged caution. She was alone, pregnant, and discovering what was essentially a secret room beneath her childhood home. But grief and curiosity formed a powerful combination, and she found herself placing one foot on the top step. The wooden stairs were solid if dusty. As she descended, her phone's light revealed more of the space. A root cellar, perhaps, though she couldn't remember her mother ever mentioning food storage. The walls were lined with rough wooden shelves, and the air grew noticeably cooler with each step. At the bottom, Sarah stood in a space roughly the size of her bedroom above. But this room wasn't empty. Along the far wall, several large objects sat covered by yellowed sheets. The musty smell was stronger here, mixed with something chemical that made her eyes water. Her light played across the sheets, revealing angular shapes underneath. Tables, maybe, or equipment of some kind. One sheet had slipped partially away, revealing what looked like the corner of a metal container. Something industrial and out of place in a simple root cellar. Sarah approached the nearest covered object, her free hand instinctively moving to her stomach again. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to climb back up those stairs and pretend she'd never found this place. But her mother's secrets seemed to call to her from beneath those dusty covers. She reached for the nearest sheet, her fingers gripping the rough fabric. Whatever lay beneath was about to answer questions she hadn't even known to ask. As she prepared to pull the covering away, a sound from above made her freeze. The distant slam of the front door. Someone else was in the house. The morning light filtering through the dusty curtains felt different somehow, as if the very air in the house had changed overnight. Sarah sat at the edge of her childhood bed, her hand instinctively resting on her belly while she stared at the floor where she'd discovered the trapdoor. In daylight, the seam in the wooden planks seemed almost invisible, just another imperfection in the old house's weathered bones. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. Every creak of the settling house had made her jump. Every shadow in the corner of her eye had seemed to move with purpose. The metallic smell from below had faded, but she couldn't shake the memory of it, that sharp copper tang that reminded her of pennies left too long in the rain. Sarah dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and an old sweater that still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender soap. She needed coffee, needed to think clearly about what she'd found. But first, she needed to see the trapdoor again in full daylight, to convince herself it wasn't some grief-induced hallucination. The kitchen felt smaller than she remembered, the yellow wallpaper more faded, the linoleum more cracked. As the coffee maker gurgled to life, Sarah found herself studying the house with new eyes. How many other secrets had her mother kept hidden? How many lies had been built into the very foundation of her childhood? Her phone buzzed against the counter. David's name lit up the screen, and for a moment she considered not answering. How could she explain what she'd found? How could she tell him that their unborn child might be connected to something dark and terrible buried beneath her family home? "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You sound awful. Did you sleep at all?" David's concern traveled clearly across the miles between them. "The house it's bringing back a lot of memories." The lie came easier than she'd expected. "How are things there?" They talked for a few minutes about his work, about the nursery they were planning, about normal things that felt surreal in the context of what she'd discovered. When she hung up, the silence of the house pressed in around her like a living thing. Coffee mug in hand, Sarah returned to her mother's bedroom. The morning sun had shifted, casting long rectangles of light across the floor. She knelt down and traced the outline of the trapdoor with her finger, feeling for the small indentation that served as a handle. The wood was warm from the sunlight, but underneath her fingertips she could feel something else, scratches in the wood, as if something sharp had scraped against it repeatedly. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pulled the trapdoor open. The smell hit her immediately, stronger now in the enclosed space. Not just metallic, but something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The darkness below seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and Sarah had to grip the edge of the opening to steady herself. She'd brought a flashlight this time, one of the heavy industrial ones her father used to keep in the garage. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough wooden stairs descending into what looked like a root cellar. The walls were lined with stone, old and moss-covered, and she could see the gleam of glass jars arranged on makeshift shelves. But it was what lay on the floor that made her stomach lurch. Bones, small ones, arranged in careful patterns across the dirt floor. Not human, at least she hoped not human, but organized with a precision that spoke of ritual, of purpose. Among the bones were other objects, twisted pieces of metal, what looked like dried flowers bound with black thread, and photographs. Sarah's hand trembled as she descended the first few steps, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The photographs were old, some dating back decades, and as she got closer, she recognized faces. Her mother as a young woman, her grandmother, stern and unsmiling. Other women she didn't recognize, but who shared the same dark eyes, the same angular features that Sarah saw in her own mirror. At the center of the bone circle was a journal, its leather cover stained and warped with age. Sarah reached for it with shaking fingers, then jerked her hand back as if burned. Whatever her mother had been involved in down here, whatever family tradition she'd been keeping alive in this hidden space beneath their home, Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to understand it. But as she stood there in the musty darkness, surrounded by the remnants of rituals she couldn't comprehend, she felt something shift inside her. Not just the baby moving, but something deeper, older. A recognition that made her blood run cold. She'd been here before. Somehow, impossibly, she remembered this place. The smell, the shadows, the careful arrangement of bones and offerings. And with that memory came another realization that made her legs weak with terror. This wasn't just her mother's secret. It was hers, too. Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the trap door. The musty air that escaped from below carried something else, a sweetness that made her stomach lurch. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, the pale beam cutting through the darkness to reveal wooden steps descending into what looked like a root cellar. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door shut and leave, but curiosity won. Her mother had hidden this space deliberately, concealing it beneath years of accumulated storage. Whatever lay below had been important enough to keep secret for decades. The steps creaked under her weight as she descended, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the reach of her phone's light. Mason jars lined makeshift shelves, their contents dark and unidentifiable in the shadows. But it was the far corner that made her breath catch. A small bed sat against the wall, child-sized, with faded quilts folded neatly at its foot. Beside it stood a wooden chair, worn smooth by years of use. The scene looked almost domestic, except for the heavy chain bolted to the wall above the headboard. Sarah's phone light wavered as her hands shook. The chain was old but sturdy, its links darkened with age, and something that looked suspiciously like rust or blood. Attached to one end was a metal cuff, sized for a child's wrist. She stumbled backward, her hip catching the edge of a wooden crate. The impact sent several items tumbling to the floor with a crash that echoed through the confined space. As she bent to retrieve them, her light illuminated what had fallen, photographs, dozens of them, scattered across the dirt floor. The first image she picked up showed a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9, with dark hair and hollow eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. The child wore a simple white dress that hung loose on her skeletal frame. But it was the background that made Sarah's blood run cold, the same stone walls that surrounded her now, the same bed, the same chain visible in the corner. She grabbed another photograph. The same girl but thinner now, her eyes vacant and staring. Then another, the child curled on the small bed, the chain clearly attached to her wrist. Photo after photo documented systematic imprisonment, a chronological record of slow deterioration. Sarah's gorge rose as she continued through the images. Some showed the girl eating from a bowl on the floor like an animal. Others captured her cowering in the corner, visible bruises marking her pale skin. The final photographs in the series showed an empty bed, the chain hanging loose against the wall. But there were more images underneath, a fresh series featuring a different child. Then another set after that, and another. Years of documentation spanning what looked like decades, each series following the same horrific pattern: capture, confinement, gradual deterioration, then disappearance. Sarah's legs gave out, sending her crashing to her knees among the scattered evidence of her mother's crimes. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, casting wild shadows as it clattered across the floor. In the shifting light, she caught sight of something else, a journal bound in cracked leather, lying open beside the overturned crate. She crawled toward it, afraid to look but unable to stop herself. The pages were filled with her mother's careful handwriting, dates and observations recorded with scientific precision. The entries detailed feeding schedules, behavioral modifications, and something called conditioning protocols. But it was the margin notes that truly horrified her. Emotional observations about each child's spirit breaking, their will to resist fading with each passing day. One entry, dated 15 years ago, made her stomach drop. Subject 7 shows remarkable resilience. May need to accelerate timeline before discovery becomes likely. The Hendricks family has been asking questions. Sarah remembered the Hendricks family. Their daughter Emma had disappeared from a school playground when Sarah was in high school. The whole town had searched for weeks, but no trace was ever found. The family eventually moved away, unable to bear the memories. She flipped through more pages, finding references to other missing children, other families destroyed by her mother's monstrous appetite. The methodical nature of the documentation was somehow worse than random violence. This was calculated, refined through years of practice. A sound from above made her freeze. Footsteps crossed the floor overhead, slow and deliberate. But that was impossible. She was alone in the house. She'd locked the front door behind her, hadn't she? The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden trapdoor. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her own ragged breathing and the frantic hammering of her heart. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her terror. Then came the sound that turned her blood to ice, the scrape of furniture being moved across the floor above, something heavy being dragged over the concealed entrance. Someone was sealing her in. The basement seemed to breathe around Sarah as she descended the creaking wooden stairs, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to pull her back up, away from whatever lay below. The air grew thicker, carrying a metallic tang that made her stomach lurch. At the bottom, she swept the flashlight beam across the concrete floor, searching for any sign of the trapdoor she'd glimpsed from above. The basement was larger than she remembered from childhood, stretching beyond the reach of her light into shadowy corners that seemed to shift and move. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents long forgotten, and an old furnace hulked in the far corner like a sleeping beast. Then she saw it. A section of the floor near the back wall looked different. Newer concrete in a rough rectangle, about 3 feet by 4 feet. The edges were poorly sealed, with dark stains seeping through the cracks like old blood. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt beside it, running her fingers along the perimeter. The concrete was thin here, almost like a cover rather than a proper foundation. She found a crowbar hanging on the wall and wedged it into one of the larger cracks. The concrete gave way easier than expected, crumbling in chunks that revealed a metal handle underneath. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped it, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to run, to never look back. But she couldn't. Not now. The trapdoor opened with a groan that echoed through the basement like a dying breath. A wave of putrid air rushed up from below, so foul that Sarah gagged and stumbled backward. The smell was indescribable, decay mixed with something chemical, something wrong. She covered her nose with her sleeve and peered down into the opening. Stone steps led into absolute darkness. The walls were rough-hewn rock, glistening with moisture that caught her flashlight beam like tears. This wasn't just a root cellar or storm shelter. This was something her mother had hidden, something she'd sealed away with concrete and silence. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from David. "How's the packing going? Miss you both." The normalcy of the message felt surreal in this moment. She almost typed back, told him to come get her, told him about the impossible thing she'd found beneath her childhood home. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her pocket. She needed to know what was down there before she involved anyone else. The descent felt endless. The stone steps were worn smooth in the centers, as if countless feet had traveled this path over many years. The walls pressed closer as she went deeper, and strange markings became visible in the stone, symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't in any alphabet she recognized. Some appeared to be carved, while others looked burned into the rock. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed a chamber that couldn't possibly exist. The space was too large, too carefully constructed to be a natural cave. The ceiling arched high above, supported by pillars that seemed to grow from the living rock, and covering every surface, walls, pillars, even parts of the floor, were photographs. Hundreds of them. Sarah stepped closer, her light illuminating face after face. Children, mostly, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Some photos were recent, printed on modern paper, while others were obviously decades old, their edges yellowed and curling. But it wasn't just the photos that made her blood freeze. Each picture had been defaced in the same way. The eyes had been carefully cut out with surgical precision, leaving dark holes that seemed to stare at her accusingly. Below each photo, written in what looked like dried blood, were dates. Birth dates, death dates, some spanning only a few years. Sarah's flashlight beam found a section of wall that made her knees buckle. Her own school pictures were there, from kindergarten through high school graduation, but unlike the others, her eyes hadn't been cut out. Instead, they'd been circled in red ink, again and again, until the circles were thick and dark. Beneath her photos, in her mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "Chosen vessel. Protect at all costs." The flashlight slipped from her numb fingers, clattering on the stone floor and spinning, sending wild shadows dancing across the wall of photographs. In the strobing light, the eyeless children seemed to move, to reach for her, to whisper warnings she couldn't quite hear. When the flashlight finally came to rest, its beam illuminated the far end of the chamber where stone altars stood in a semicircle. Dark stains covered their surfaces, and iron shackles hung from their sides like dead serpents. Between them, carved deep into the rock, was a symbol that made Sarah's vision blur and her unborn child kick frantically within her womb. She knew, with horrible certainty, that her mother hadn't been protecting her from this place. Her mother had been preparing her for it. The wooden stairs groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended into the darkness below. Each step felt like a betrayal of common sense, but something stronger than fear pulled her downward, a magnetic need to understand what her mother had hidden beneath their home for all these years. The beam of her phone's flashlight cut through the musty air, revealing rough stone walls that seemed much older than the house above. The space was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the reach of her light. As her feet touched the earthen floor, the temperature dropped noticeably, raising goosebumps along her arms. The smell hit her immediately, a cocktail of decay, mildew, and something else she couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. Sarah pressed her sleeve against her nose and mouth, fighting the urge to gag. The baby seemed to sense her distress, shifting restlessly as her heart rate spiked. She swept the light across the cellar, trying to map its dimensions. To her left, shelves lined the wall, filled with mason jars whose contents remained mercifully obscured in shadow. Straight ahead, she could make out what looked like a workbench or table, but it was the wall to her right that made her breath catch in her throat. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned directly to the stone with rusty thumbtacks. The beam of her light revealed glimpses of faces, but from this distance she couldn't make out the details. Sarah forced herself to move closer, each step an act of will. The first photo stopped her cold. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with Sarah's own dark hair and her mother's sharp cheekbones. But the girl's eyes held a terror that made Sarah's stomach lurch. She was bound to what looked like the same table that sat in the center of this cellar, her mouth open in a silent scream. Sarah's hand shook as she moved the light to the next photograph. Another child, This one a boy with sandy hair and freckles, the same table, the same ropes, the same expression of pure, animalistic fear. "Oh God," she whispered, backing away from the wall. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." But the photographs seemed to follow her, burned into her retinas. There were so many of them. Different children, different time periods, judging by the clothing and photo quality, but all sharing that same horrific tableau, all positioned on that table in the center of the room where she now stood. Sarah spun around, her light wildly searching for the stairs, for escape, for anything that would take her away from this nightmare. But in her panic, she stumbled backward, her hip connecting hard with the edge of the table. The impact sent something skittering across the wooden surface. Sarah's light found it immediately, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and warped with age. Next to it lay an assortment of tools that made her blood run cold, restraints, knives of various sizes, and something that looked disturbingly like medical instruments. The journal lay open, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah found herself reading the spidery handwriting on the visible page. "The Hartwell bloodline carries the gift, but it must be nurtured, cultivated through proper ritual. Margaret understands now, as her grandmother understood before her. The children provide the necessary essence, their fear and pain feeding the ancient hunger that lives within us. Soon, Margaret's own daughter will be old enough to witness the ceremonies. The gift must be passed down generation to generation, or our family will face consequences far worse than death." Sarah's vision blurred. Margaret, that was her grandmother's name. The grandmother who had died when Sarah was only 3, leaving behind nothing but a few scattered memories and her mother's tight-lipped reluctance to discuss her. She flipped through more pages, her horror mounting with each entry. Dates spanning decades, names she didn't recognize, detailed descriptions of rituals that made her stomach heave, and threaded through it all, references to the gift and the hunger and the necessity of feeding both. The final entry was in different handwriting, her mother's careful script. "I cannot continue what my mother started. I will not let Sarah become part of this madness. The hunger grows stronger each year I deny it, but I would rather die than involve my daughter in these unspeakable acts. I have sealed the entrance and destroyed the remaining implements. Let this evil die with me." Sarah's phone slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. In the sudden black silence, she could hear her own ragged breathing and the wild hammering of her heart. But underneath those sounds, she could swear she heard something else, whispering. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, voices layered upon voices, speaking words in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They spoke of hunger, of need, of the gift that flowed in her veins and the child she carried who would inherit it all. Sarah's hands instinctively moved to protect her belly as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. In the darkness, she finally understood the true horror of what her mother had tried to protect her from, and she realized that some family legacies could never truly be buried. The basement felt different in the morning light filtering through the dirty windows. What had seemed like an impossible nightmare now revealed itself in stark, undeniable reality. Sarah stood at the top of the basement stairs, her hand trembling on the railing as she stared down at the open trap door. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through fragments of what she'd witnessed, the cramped space below, the scratched walls, the chains. Most haunting of all, the photographs scattered across her mother's desk upstairs, images that made her stomach churn with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. Sarah pressed her palm against her belly, trying to draw comfort from the movement, but even that felt tainted now. How could she bring a child into this? How could she raise a family when her own bloodline carried such darkness? Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "How's the packing going? Miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight." Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could she possibly say? That she'd discovered her mother was a monster? That their future child might carry genes that could manifest into something unspeakable? That everything she thought she knew about her identity was built on lies? Instead, she typed, making progress. "See you soon." The lie felt heavy in her throat. Sarah forced herself down the basement steps, each footfall echoing in the silence. She needed answers, and the only place to find them was in the hidden room below. This time, she came prepared with a powerful flashlight and her phone's camera. Whatever truth lay buried here, she had to document it. The trapdoor yawned open like a mouth. Sarah lowered herself through the opening, her pregnant belly making the descent awkward. The stench hit her immediately, a cocktail of mold, decay, and something else that made her gag. She breathed through her mouth and swept the flashlight beam across the cramped space. The walls told a story written in scratches and stains, deep gouges in the wood, some forming what looked like desperate attempts at words. Sarah moved closer, her heart hammering as she made out letters carved into the surface. Help and please, and something that might have been sorry. In one corner, she found a collection of items that made her blood run cold. Children's toys, faded and dirty, a stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, building blocks scattered as if dropped in haste, and beneath them, something that made her breath catch. A small bracelet with the name Emma spelled out in colorful beads. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed everything. She'd never heard her mother mention anyone named Emma, but the bracelet looked decades old enough to be from her mother's generation. A loose floorboard caught her attention. Unlike the others, it sat slightly raised as if recently disturbed. Sarah pried it up with her fingers, revealing a shallow hiding space underneath. Inside lay a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, recognizing her mother's handwriting immediately, though the words were written in the shaky script of someone much younger. Day 3. Emma won't stop crying. I brought her more food, but she just pushes it away. Mother says I have to be patient, says this is how our family has always learned. But I don't understand why Emma has to suffer for me to get better. Sarah's vision blurred. She flipped to another entry. Day 8. I can hear Emma talking to herself down there. She's making up stories about going home. I want to tell her she can't go home, but Mother says I'm not allowed to talk to her anymore. Mother says Emma is helping me become what I'm supposed to be, what we're supposed to be. The journal slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers. Her mother had been a child when she wrote these entries, a child who had been forced to participate in something unspeakable. But that didn't excuse what came after. The photographs upstairs proved that her mother had continued the family tradition into adulthood. How many children had suffered in this space? How many families had grieved for sons and daughters who never came home? Sarah scrambled toward the trapdoor, desperate for fresh air, but froze when she heard footsteps above. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. She held her breath, straining to listen. Michael wasn't supposed to arrive until evening. She'd given him the spare key, but he would have called first. Wouldn't he? The footsteps paused directly above the basement. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone trying the basement door handle. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She was trapped in a tomb beneath her childhood home, surrounded by evidence of decades of horror, while someone moved through the house above her. Someone who might know exactly what lay hidden beneath the floorboards. The basement door opened with a long, drawn-out creak. "Sarah?" a voice called down into the darkness. "Are you down there, dear? We need to talk." The basement walls seemed to pulse in the flickering candlelight as Sarah stared at the photograph in her trembling hands. The image showed her mother as a young woman, standing beside a man Sarah had never seen before. But it wasn't the stranger that made her blood run cold. It was what lay at their feet, a small bundle wrapped in white cloth, no bigger than a loaf of bread. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, her mind reeling. The date scrawled on the back read October 1985, exactly 9 months before Sarah was born. Behind the couple, she could make out the familiar outline of the house above, though it looked different somehow, newer. A soft shuffling sound echoed from deeper within the underground chamber. and Sarah's head snapped up. The candle flame danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe along the stone walls. She held her breath, straining to listen, but heard only the thundering of her own heartbeat. Moving deeper into the chamber, she discovered more photographs scattered across a makeshift table constructed from old wooden planks and concrete blocks. Each image told a piece of a story she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Her mother, younger and somehow different, harder around the edges, the same mysterious man appearing in several shots, and always somewhere in the frame those terrible white bundles. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her distress, and she whispered a quiet apology to the life growing inside her. Whatever sins her family had committed, whatever darkness had taken root in this house, she couldn't let it touch her child. A journal lay open beside the photographs, its pages yellowed and brittle. Sarah recognized her mother's careful handwriting, though the words seemed to belong to a stranger. He says the ritual requires 3. The first was easy. No one asks questions about a vagrant. The second fought harder than expected. But the third must be willing. He promises it will end after the third, that we'll be free to start our family properly. I pray he's telling the truth. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto an overturned crate. The journal slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo endlessly in the confined space. 3 people had died here. 3 people had been murdered to satisfy some twisted ritual, and her mother had been complicit. But who was he? And what family had they been trying to start? The answer came as she turned the page. A birth certificate, official and stamped, with her name printed in stark black letters. But the father's name wasn't the one she'd grown up knowing. Instead, it bore the signature of someone called Marcus Thorne, the same name that appeared in several of the photographs. Sarah's world tilted. David Brennan, the man she'd called father until his death when she was 16, hadn't been her biological parent. This Marcus Thorne was her real father, and judging by the photographs, he'd been involved in whatever horrific acts had taken place in this underground chamber. A new sound drifted through the darkness, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Sarah grabbed the candle and spun toward the noise, her heart hammering against her ribs. The flame guttered in a sudden draft, nearly extinguishing before catching again. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting the impulse. If someone was down here with her, alerting them to her presence seemed like a catastrophically bad idea. The scraping stopped. Sarah waited, every muscle tensed for flight, but the silence stretched on. Gathering the photographs and journal, she began backing toward the ladder. Whatever other secrets this place held could wait. She needed to get out, needed to process what she'd already discovered before diving deeper into her family's nightmare. As she reached for the ladder's bottom rung, her foot knocked against something hard. Looking down, she saw a metal box, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she knelt and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of items that made her stomach lurch. Teeth, some small enough to belong to a child, locks of hair in various colors tied with ribbon, and most horrifying of all, 3 driver's licenses bearing the faces of people she'd never seen. Their eyes stared up at her with the haunting quality of the dead, and she realized she was looking at Marcus Thorne's victims. The scraping sound resumed, closer now and definitely moving in her direction. Sarah didn't wait to see what was making the noise. Clutching the evidence against her chest, she scrambled up the ladder with desperate speed. Her pregnant body protested the exertion, but terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, something emerged into the candlelight, something that had been waiting in the deeper darkness, patient as death itself. But Sarah was already through the trap door, slamming it shut and dragging the heavy chest back over the opening. Whatever lived in her family's buried past would have to wait. The darkness beneath the house seemed to breathe around Sarah as she descended the rickety wooden steps, each creak echoing through the narrow space like a warning. The flashlight beam cut through the musty air, revealing glimpses of rough stone walls that looked far older than the house above. Her free hand instinctively moved to her belly, a protective gesture that had become second nature since discovering her pregnancy. The smell hit her first, a sickly sweet odor that made her stomach lurch. It wasn't the typical mustiness of an old basement. This was something organic, something that spoke of decay and secrets left to fester in the dark. She pressed her sleeve against her nose and forced herself to continue down. At the bottom of the steps, Sarah's flashlight revealed a small chamber carved directly into the earth. The walls were lined with what appeared to be journals, dozens of them, bound in leather and stacked on makeshift shelves. But it was the far corner that made her blood freeze. A child's rocking chair sat motionless in the shadows, its paint long since faded to an indeterminate color. Beside it, a small table held what looked like toys, a porcelain doll with cracked features, building blocks arranged in careful towers, a teddy bear whose button eyes caught the light like black stars. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if time had simply stopped in this underground tomb. Sarah stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The journal nearest to her was open, and her mother's familiar handwriting sprawled across the yellowed pages. She lifted it with trembling hands and read the first entry her light revealed. Day 127. She spoke to me again today. Asked why she couldn't go outside like the other children. I told her the same thing I always do, that she's special, that the world above isn't ready for her, but she's getting restless. The nightmares are getting worse. The words swam before Sarah's eyes. She? Other children? Nothing made sense. She flipped backward through the journal, finding entry after entry in her mother's careful script, each one more disturbing than the last. Day 89. The transformation is accelerating. Dr. Morrison says it's normal for her age, but I can see the fear in his eyes when he looks at her. The medication isn't working anymore. Day 45. Found her standing over the neighbor's cat this morning. What she did to it? I can't write it down. Can't think about it. Had to tell the Hendersons it ran away. Day 12, she was born at 3:33 a.m., just like her mother predicted. The resemblance is unmistakable now. The same eyes, the same smile. God help us all. Sarah's hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the journal. Her mother had written about another child, someone who had lived down here in the dark. The dates went back 25 years. Exactly Sarah's age. But that was impossible. Sarah was an only child. She'd always been an only child. She grabbed another journal from the shelf, this one even older. The pages were brittle, threatening to crumble at her touch, but the words were still legible, still damning. Margaret asked me today why we keep her down there. How do I explain that what we call our daughter isn't really our daughter anymore? That thing wearing her face, speaking with her voice, it's something else entirely, something hungry. The flashlight beam wavered as Sarah's grip loosened. Margaret, her grandmother's name. These journals weren't just her mother's. They spanned generations. Entry after entry documented the same horrible pattern, a daughter born, hidden away, becoming something monstrous. No, Sarah whispered to the darkness. This isn't real. But the evidence surrounded her. The journals, the childish belongings, the careful documentation of something her family had kept hidden for decades. She thought of her mother's dying words, the warning about the baby, the insistence that Sarah leave and never come back. A sound from above made her freeze, footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, heavy, deliberate steps that definitely weren't hers. Sarah switched off the flashlight and pressed herself against the stone wall, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain whoever was upstairs would hear it. The footsteps moved slowly, methodically, as if searching. They paused directly above her hiding place. In the absolute darkness, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. A child's voice, high and sweet, drifting down through the floorboards. "Mama? I know you're down there. I've been waiting for you to come home." The voice was innocent, pleading, but there was something wrong with it, something that didn't quite sound human despite the perfect words. Sarah pressed her hand harder against her mouth to stifle a sob. The footsteps resumed, lighter now, almost skipping. They moved toward the front of the house, then stopped. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats, praying that whatever was up there would leave. Instead, she heard the unmistakable sound of the front door closing. Then nothing but silence and the weight of generations of family secrets pressing down on her from above. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the newspaper clipping up to the weak basement light. The headline screamed across yellowed paper, "Local woman disappears after reporting missing daughter." Below it, a grainy photograph showed a younger version of her mother standing beside a police officer, her face etched with what Sarah had always believed was grief over losing a child to illness. But Emily hadn't died of leukemia. Emily had been taken. The date on the clipping made Sarah's stomach lurch, 3 months before her own birth. She flipped through more articles, each one painting a picture that grew more horrifying with every word. Emily Chen, age 7, vanished from the park 2 blocks from their house. Her mother, Margaret, had organized search parties, pleaded on local television, offered rewards they couldn't afford. Then, suddenly, Margaret had stopped. The final article was brief. Mother of missing girl withdraws from search efforts. It quoted Margaret as saying she needed to focus on her family's future and her new pregnancy. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto the cold concrete floor. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling. Her sister hadn't died, she'd been kidnapped, and somehow, impossibly, she was still here. A sound drifted down from above, so faint Sarah almost missed it, humming. The same melody Emily had been singing in the tunnel, now coming through the basement ceiling. Her mother's voice, warm and familiar, carrying the tune that had haunted Sarah's dreams for weeks. But her mother was dead, had been for 3 months. Sarah scrambled to her feet, the newspaper clippings scattering around her. The humming grew louder, accompanied by the creak of floorboards overhead. Someone was walking through the house, the same measured pace her mother had taken during her evening rituals, checking locks, turning off lights. Fighting every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah crept up the basement stairs. The door at the top stood slightly ajar, and warm light spilled through the gap. Light that hadn't been on when she'd come down here. She pressed her eye to the crack and peered into the kitchen. A figure moved past the doorway, just a glimpse of grey hair and a familiar floral robe, the same robe Sarah had buried her mother in. The humming stopped abruptly. "Sarah, dear, is that you down there?" Her mother's voice, perfectly normal, perfectly alive. Sarah's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, but her heart recognized that voice like a fingerprint. She pushed open the door and stepped into the kitchen. Margaret Chen stood at the sink, her back to Sarah, washing dishes that hadn't been dirty moments before. She looked exactly as she had in life. Thin shoulders curved with age, silver hair pinned back in a neat bun, the small mole on her neck that Sarah remembered kissing goodnight as a child. "I was wondering when you'd find those old papers," Margaret said, without turning around. "I should have thrown them away years ago." "Mom," the word came out as barely a whisper. "Come sit, sweetheart. We need to talk." Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel, the same yellow one with faded daisies that Sarah remembered from childhood. "I know you have questions." Sarah remained frozen by the basement door, every muscle in her body coiled to run. "You're dead. I watched them put you in the ground." Margaret finally turned, and Sarah's breath caught. Her mother looked exactly as she remembered, but her eyes were different, ancient, tired in a way that went deeper than age or illness. "Death is more complicated than we pretend it is," Margaret said, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "Just like family, just like love." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. Think of the baby." Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself moving toward the table. The kitchen looked exactly as it had when she was growing up. Same checkered curtains, same ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, same scratch in the wood where she'd carved her initials at age 8. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice cracking, She didn't die of cancer. No. Margaret's expression grew pained. She didn't die at all. That was the problem. What do you mean? Margaret reached across the table, her fingers ice cold against Sarah's skin. Do you know what it's like to watch your child slip away? To see them become something else, something hungry? To know that every day they exist, other children disappear? Sarah jerked her hand back. What are you talking about? Emily came back wrong, Sarah. 3 days after she vanished, she just appeared in her bedroom like nothing had happened. But she wasn't my little girl anymore. She was something wearing her face, speaking with her voice, needing things no child should need. The baby kicked violently, and Sarah pressed both hands to her stomach. You're not making sense. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that looked real enough to break Sarah's heart. I tried to love her anyway. God help me, I tried. But when I found what she'd hidden under her bed, when I realized what she'd been doing to stay fed, that's when I knew I had to choose. Between the daughter I'd lost and the daughters of strangers. Between Emily and you. Sarah's hands trembled as she pressed the journal against her chest, her mother's final words echoing in her mind. The curse follows bloodlines. The basement felt suffocating now, the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. She needed air, needed to think, but first she had to understand what her mother had really done down here. The ritual circle drew her attention again, its chalk lines still sharp and deliberate despite the years. As she approached, she noticed something she'd missed before. Small dark stains scattered around the perimeter, not rust from old pipes or water damage. Blood. Some spots looked fresher than others, creating a timeline of desperate attempts spanning decades. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from David. How's the packing going? Missing you. The normalcy of his message felt surreal. How could she explain that everything they'd planned, the nursery, the names they'd chosen, their quiet suburban future, might be built on a foundation of ancient horror? Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where their child grew, unaware of the darkness that might already be claiming it. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the kitchen floor directly above her head. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd locked the front door, the back door. Every window was sealed tight against the November cold, but someone was in her house. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, heading toward the basement door. Panic seized her throat. She looked around desperately for another exit, but there was none. The basement had only one way in and out, and whoever was upstairs now stood between her and freedom. The single bulb overhead seemed to dim, casting longer shadows that writhed and shifted like living things. The basement door creaked open. "Sarah?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar yet somehow expected. "I know you're down there, child. I can smell the awakening on you." Footsteps on the wooden stairs, each one a nail in Sarah's coffin. She pressed herself against the far wall, clutching the journal like a shield. Through the gaps between the stairs, she glimpsed a pair of weathered boots, then the hem of a long dark coat. "There's no point in hiding." The voice was closer now, patient and almost kind. "Your mother told me this day would come, when she could no longer hold the bindings, when the responsibility would pass to you." The woman reached the bottom of the stairs and turned. She was elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to hold starlight. Despite her age, she moved with an unsettling grace, as if gravity affected her differently. "Who are you?" Sarah managed to whisper. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood, your grandmother's sister, your great-aunt." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach those strange eyes. "Though I suppose your mother never mentioned me. Margaret always was ashamed of the family gifts." "Gifts?" Sarah pressed harder against the wall, wishing she could disappear into the concrete. Eleanor gestured to the ritual circle, to the symbols carved into the walls, to the basement that had become a temple to something ancient and hungry. "This, child, the ability to commune with what lies beyond the veil, to offer tribute to powers that most people pretend don't exist. You mean sacrifice." The word tasted like poison. Such an ugly term for something so necessary. Eleanor began walking slowly around the circle's perimeter, her fingers trailing over the chalk marks with reverence. Your bloodline has been chosen, Sarah. For 300 years, the women of our family have served as guardians, keeping the ancient ones satisfied, with small offerings so they don't demand larger ones. The babies, Sarah whispered, the truth crashing over her like a wave. You've been feeding them babies. Eleanor paused, her head tilting slightly. Not all babies, just the ones marked from birth, the ones who carry the sight. They serve a greater purpose. Sarah's hand flew to her stomach. No, I won't let you touch my child. Oh, dear girl. Eleanor's laugh was like wind through dead leaves. You think you have a choice? The mark is already on you. I can see it growing stronger every day. And your child, her eyes fixed on Sarah's belly with an hunger that made Sarah's skin crawl. Your child will be the most powerful offering in generations. The ancient ones are practically humming with anticipation. Sarah bolted for the stairs, but Eleanor moved impossibly fast, blocking her path with outstretched arms. Up close, Sarah could see that the woman's skin had an odd, translucent quality, and her eyes held depths that human eyes shouldn't possess. Running won't help, Eleanor said gently. Your mother tried to run once. We brought her back. We always bring them back. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the blackness, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of many feet shuffling across the basement floor surrounding her. Welcome home, Sarah, Eleanor's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. It's time to learn about your true inheritance. The rope burned against Sarah's palms as she lowered herself back into the cellar, her phone's flashlight casting wild shadows across the earthen walls. The journal clutched against her chest felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, each page a revelation more horrifying than the last. Her mother's careful handwriting had documented 27 years of feeding schedules, growth measurements, and behavioral observations, all centered around the thing that had once been Sarah's twin sister. The feeding tube lay coiled in the corner like a sleeping snake, still damp from recent use. Sarah's stomach lurched as she realized her mother had been down here just days before her death, tending to whatever Amy had become. The thought of her mother, weak from chemotherapy, climbing down that rope to perform this grotesque ritual, made Sarah's vision blur with tears and rage. She forced herself to examine the restraints bolted to the wall. Heavy iron shackles, worn smooth from decades of use, connected to chains that disappeared into the shadows. The scratches in the dirt around them told a story of struggle, of something that had grown stronger over the years despite its confinement. A soft sound echoed from the tunnel's mouth, a wet, sliding noise that made every nerve in Sarah's body scream. She clicked off her phone's light and pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. The baby shifted restlessly in her womb as if sensing her terror. The sound came again, closer now. Sarah could hear breathing, labored and uneven, accompanied by the scrape of something being dragged across stone. She fumbled for her phone, accidentally dropping the journal. The leather-bound book hit the ground with a muffled thump that seemed to echo forever in the confined space. Everything went silent. Sarah held her breath, counting the seconds that stretched like hours. 10, 20, 30. Just as she began to think she had imagined the sounds, a voice drifted from the tunnel, high and sweet, like a child's lullaby. Sarah? Is that you, Sarah? Mother said you were coming home. The voice was wrong in ways that Sarah's mind struggled to process. It had the cadence of speech, but underneath lurked something inhuman, like vocal cords that had been stretched and twisted beyond their natural limits. The words were clear enough, but they carried undertones that made Sarah's skin crawl. I've been waiting so long to meet you properly. Mother showed me pictures, told me stories. My beautiful sister, living up there in the light while I stayed down here in the dark. But that's changing now, isn't it? Sarah's hand found the rope, her muscles tensing for escape, but the voice continued, seeming to move through the tunnels with impossible speed. Don't run. Please don't run. I won't hurt you. I could never hurt my twin. But I am so very hungry, Sarah. Mother's gone now, and there's no one to bring me what I need, what we need." The emphasis on "we" made Sarah's blood turn to ice. She remembered the journal's final entries, her mother's growing concern about Amy's questions regarding Sarah's pregnancy. "The thing in the tunnels knew about the baby. I can smell it, you know. The new life growing inside you. It calls to me like nothing ever has." Mother tried to explain, but she never really understood. She thought she was keeping me fed, keeping me satisfied, but those people she brought, they were never enough, never the right kind of nourishment. Sarah's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. The missing persons report she'd seen in her research, the newspaper clippings her mother had saved. They hadn't been random disappearances. Her mother had been hunting, providing live prey for the abomination that wore her sister's name. A wet, slithering sound echoed from directly above her, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that there were multiple tunnel entrances. The thing wasn't approaching from the main passage. It was already here, somewhere in the walls around her. The baby will be perfect, won't it? Fresh and pure, unmarked by the world above. And you, dear sister, you'll stay with me afterward. We'll be a family again, just like Mother always wanted. Just like we were supposed to be before I got sick. Sarah's flashlight beam swept frantically across the ceiling, revealing nothing but packed earth and wooden support beams. But she could hear movement up there, a scratching and shifting that suggested something large navigating through spaces far too small for a human body. "I know you're frightened. Mother was frightened too at first, but you'll understand soon. You'll see how necessary this all is. The hunger is so much stronger now, Sarah. It grows with each passing day, and I can feel it changing me, making me into something better, something that can protect our family." The scratching stopped directly overhead. Dirt began to rain down in thin streams, and Sarah saw the wooden beam above her head start to bow under some tremendous weight. She grabbed the rope and began to climb with desperate strength, the journal forgotten on the floor below. Behind her, something massive began to tear through the ceiling with wet, tearing sounds that would haunt her dreams forever. The static from her mother's old radio crackled through the kitchen as Sarah sat hunched over the yellowed documents spread across the table. Her hands trembled as she traced the faded ink with her finger, reading the same horrifying words over and over. Birth certificates, death certificates, medical records dating back 40 years, all bearing her mother's maiden name, and all documenting children Sarah had never known existed. 7 names, 7 siblings she'd never met, never heard whispered about in family stories. Each certificate told the same devastating tale: born healthy, died within months under mysterious circumstances. The causes of death varied: sudden infant death syndrome, unexplained fever, respiratory failure, but the dates formed a chilling pattern. Every few years, like clockwork, another baby would arrive and vanish. Sarah's stomach lurched as she counted backward. She was born in 1987, 3 years after little Michael's death certificate was dated. Had her mother spent those years grieving, planning? The gaps between the deaths grew longer toward the end, as if her mother had been growing more careful, more selective about when to act on whatever compulsion drove her. The basement door stood ajar behind her, and she could smell that distinctive metallic scent drifting upward even with the trapdoor sealed. She'd tried calling the police twice, but her phone showed no signal. The landline had been disconnected years ago. The isolation that had once made this house feel peaceful now felt like a trap. A sudden thump from upstairs made her freeze. Sarah held her breath, listening. Nothing but the wind rattling the windows and the radio's persistent static. She turned back to the papers, forcing herself to focus despite the fear crawling up her spine. At the bottom of the stack she found her own birth certificate. But something was wrong with it. The paper was different, newer, crisper. And there, in the corner, a small notation in her mother's handwriting: replacement copy. Original destroyed 1987. Why would her mother need to replace her birth certificate? Sarah studied the document more carefully, noting discrepancies she'd never noticed before. Her father's name was listed as unknown, but she remembered him. Vaguely, but still, he'd been there until she was 5. The address listed wasn't this house, but some place in the next county she'd never heard of. Another thump upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She grabbed the papers, shoving them into a folder as quietly as possible. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving across the ceiling directly above her. Someone was in her mother's bedroom. She crept toward the kitchen doorway, avoiding the floorboards she knew creaked. The radio's static seemed deafening now, masking any sound she might make but also preventing her from hearing clearly what was happening above. She reached over and twisted the volume knob, plunging the house into an eerie silence. The footsteps had stopped. Sarah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing her fear. She pressed a protective hand to her belly, thinking of those 7 death certificates. Had her mother stood in this same kitchen, listening for danger while planning the unthinkable? A shadow moved past the window, visible for just a moment in her peripheral vision. Sarah spun toward it, but saw only the wind-blown branches of the old oak tree. The late afternoon light was fading, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. She needed to get out of the house. Whatever secrets her mother had buried here, whatever family legacy of horror she'd stumbled into, Sarah couldn't face it alone, not with the baby to protect. She gathered the folder and moved toward the front door, testing each step carefully. The door was locked. The deadbolt that she never remembered her mother using was firmly engaged, and the key wasn't in its usual spot on the hook nearby. Sarah's breathing quickened as she checked the back door, then the side door leading to the mudroom. All locked from the inside, all missing their keys. She was trapped. The footsteps resumed upstairs, accompanied now by a sound she couldn't identify. A rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah backed toward the kitchen, clutching the folder to her chest. Her mother's secrets seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in her hands. As she reached for her phone to try calling for help again, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The basement door, which she was certain she'd left ajar, was now wide open. The darkness below seemed to breathe with a life of its own, and from somewhere in those depths came the faint sound of crying. Not the wailing of an adult, but the weak, desperate mewling of an infant. Sarah's knees buckled as the horrible truth began to crystallize. The death certificates, the missing years in her own past, the locked doors, and now this impossible sound from below. Her mother hadn't just hidden evidence of her crimes in the basement, she'd hidden the survivors. Sarah's hand trembled as she dialed Detective Morrison's number, her eyes never leaving the basement door. The phone rang once, twice. Morrison. "Detective, it's Sarah Chen. I need you to come back to the house immediately. I found something else." "What kind of something?" Sarah swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. Bodies, multiple bodies. And they're not old. The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like an eternity. "Don't touch anything. Don't go back down there. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her discovery. She backed away from the basement, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and sank into her mother's worn armchair. The house felt different now, not just hiding secrets, but actively malevolent, as if the walls themselves were complicit in whatever horrors lay beneath. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "How's the packing going? Miss you." Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that she'd stumbled into a nightmare, that her mother, the woman who'd braided her hair and made pancakes on Sunday mornings, had apparently been something monstrous? The baby moved inside her, a gentle flutter that felt obscene in the context of what she'd just witnessed. She pressed her hand to her stomach, wondering what kind of blood ran through her veins, what genetic legacy she was passing on to her unborn child. Car doors slammed outside. Through the window, Sarah watched Detective Morrison approach with 2 other officers and what looked like a crime scene photographer. The cavalry had arrived, but she felt no relief. Morrison's knock was sharp, authoritative. "Sarah, it's Detective Morrison. She opened the door to find his weathered face grim with concern. "You okay?" "I don't know." The honesty surprised her. "I don't think I'll ever be okay again." He stepped inside, his team following. "Tell me exactly what you found." Sarah led them to the basement door, her legs unsteady. "Down there, past the room where we found the altar, there's another chamber." She paused, forcing herself to continue. "There are bodies wrapped in plastic, fresh ones." Morrison exchanged glances with his partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes. "How many?" I didn't count. Maybe 5? 6? Sarah's voice cracked. "Detective, one of them was wearing modern clothes. Jeans and sneakers that couldn't be more than a few years old." The team descended into the basement, their flashlight beams dancing across the walls like malevolent spirits. Sarah remained upstairs, pacing the kitchen, unable to sit still. Every creak of the old house made her jump. Every shadow seemed to writhe with accusation. 20 minutes later, Morrison emerged, his face pale despite his professional composure. "Sarah, we need to talk." She met his eyes, seeing her worst fears reflected there. "How bad?" "Bad." He pulled out his notebook, though Sarah suspected he wasn't really reading from it. "We count 7 bodies in various stages of decomposition. The newest appears to be perhaps 6 months old, the oldest maybe 3 years. The kitchen spun around her. 6 months? But my mother died 8 months ago." "I know." Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. "Which means either your mother had help, or what? Or someone else has been using this house since her death." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone had been coming here, continuing whatever sick ritual her mother had started. Someone who might still have access to the house. "We're going to need to process this as an active crime scene," Morrison continued. "And Sarah, I need to ask, have you noticed anything unusual since you've been here? Any signs that someone might have been in the house?" Sarah's mind raced back through the past few days, the sense of being watched, the cold spots that couldn't be explained by old windows or poor insulation, the feeling that things had been moved when she wasn't looking. "Yes," she whispered. "I thought I was imagining it, but yes." Morrison nodded grimly. "I'm posting an officer outside tonight. And Sarah, I strongly recommend you don't stay here alone." "I can't leave. Not yet." The words surprised her, but she meant them. "There are still answers down there, things I need to understand. This isn't about understanding anymore. This is about survival." Sarah looked around the kitchen where her mother had taught her to cook, where they'd shared countless meals and conversations. How many secrets had been swallowed with Sunday dinner? How many lies had been served alongside home-baked cookies? "Detective," she said quietly, "I think my mother was just the beginning. I think whatever's been happening here, it's bigger than one person, and I think it's not over." Morrison closed his notebook with a snap. "Then we better figure out who else is involved before they figure out you're here." The basement felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made Sarah's skin crawl. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, and the air itself felt thick, almost viscous. She could taste copper on her tongue, metallic and wrong. Her mother's journal lay open in her trembling hands, the final entries revealing the terrible truth. Margaret Chen hadn't been protecting Sarah from the family legacy. She'd been feeding it. Every birthday, every milestone, every moment of happiness in Sarah's life had been carefully orchestrated to strengthen whatever ancient thing lived in the walls of this house. "The bloodline must continue," Sarah read aloud, her voice cracking. "The child will be the strongest yet. She carries 3 generations of preparation." The baby kicked violently as if responding to the words. Sarah gasped, dropping the journal as a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. This wasn't a normal movement. It felt deliberate, aggressive. Something was wrong. A sound echoed from the hidden chamber behind the false wall, a wet, sliding noise that raised every hair on Sarah's arms. She'd thought the room was empty when she'd fled earlier, but now she realized she'd been wrong. Something had been waiting, listening. The temperature plummeted. Sarah's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air as frost began forming on the concrete walls. The overhead bulb flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "Sarah." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the house itself. "Come home, child." It was her mother's voice, but wrong, layered with something else, something old and hungry. Sarah backed toward the stairs, but her feet felt leaden, as if the very air was fighting her movement. "You can't run from what you are," the voice continued, closer now. "What we made you to be." The false wall began to creak, the hidden hinges groaning under some invisible pressure. Sarah realized with growing horror that something was pushing from the other side, something that wanted out. She turned and ran for the stairs, but made it only 3 steps before the pain hit her like a sledgehammer. Sarah collapsed, clutching her stomach as agony tore through her body. The baby was moving frantically now, pressing against her ribs, her organs, as if trying to claw its way out. Behind her, the hidden door burst open with a sound like breaking bones. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. The wrongness radiating from that opening was so intense it made her vision blur and her thoughts scatter. She crawled up the basement stairs on her hands and knees, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her swollen belly. The house groaned around her, walls settling with sounds that formed almost words. The temperature continued to drop, and Sarah could see her breath now, quick puffs of vapor in the impossible cold. Ice crystals formed on the wooden steps beneath her palms. She reached the kitchen and hauled herself upright using the counter, gasping. Her phone. Where was her phone? She needed to call for help, needed to get away from this place before the lights went out. In the absolute darkness, Sarah heard footsteps on the basement stairs, slow, deliberate steps that didn't sound quite human, too heavy, too wet, and between each footfall, that sliding sound, as if something was being dragged. Sarah fumbled blindly for her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip anything. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs and paused. In the silence, Sarah could hear breathing that sounded like wind through a graveyard. Her fingers finally closed around her phone. The screen's glow seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and Sarah nearly sobbed with relief. But as she started to dial 911, she saw something that made her blood freeze. The camera app was open, and it was recording. On the screen, she could see herself hunched over the kitchen counter, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the phone's infrared sensor, stood a figure that was almost human, almost her mother. But where Margaret Chen's face should have been was a shifting mass of shadow and teeth, and her hands. God, her hands were wrong, too long, ending in things that weren't quite fingers. The thing wearing her mother's shape smiled, and Sarah could see every tooth through the phone's display. Too many teeth, too sharp. "Time to finish what we started," it said in Margaret's voice. Sarah spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The basement door hung open like a mouth, and cold air poured out of it, carrying the smell of earth and decay and something else, something sweet and rotten that made her stomach lurch. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah felt something tear inside her. Warm wetness spread down her legs, and she realized with mounting terror that her water had broken. The thing in the darkness laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying birds. Sarah ran. Sarah's fingers trembled as she clutched the journal against her chest, her mother's final words echoing in her mind like a death knell. The basement felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of generations of lies. She had to get out, had to get away from this house, from this town, from everything her family had built on blood and bones. But as she turned toward the stairs, a sound froze her in place. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor above her head. Someone was in the house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd locked the front door when she arrived, hadn't she? The memory felt distant, unreliable. Everything since finding the trapdoor seemed wrapped in a haze of horror that made rational thought nearly impossible. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the basement door. Sarah heard the old hinges creak as it opened, and then a voice, familiar yet wrong, called down into the darkness. "Sarah, I know you're down there, sweetheart." It was Uncle Thomas. But there was something in his tone that made her skin crawl, a false warmth that couldn't mask the underlying threat. Her mother's brother had always been kind to her, always brought presents at Christmas, and remembered her birthday. But now, with her mother's journal clutched in her hands and the truth sprawling before her like an open wound, Sarah understood that everything, every smile, every gift, every moment of supposed family love had been part of the lie. "Come on up, Sarah. We need to talk." She pressed herself against the far wall, mind racing. The basement had no other exit except through the main house. She was trapped, and Uncle Thomas knew it. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing inside her. Whatever happened next, she had to survive. Her child depended on it. "I found Mother's journal," she called out, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I know what you did, what the whole family did." A long silence stretched between them. Then she heard him begin descending the stairs, each step deliberate and measured. When he reached the bottom, Sarah saw that he looked different somehow, older, more haggard, as if maintaining the family's facade had finally become too exhausting to bear. "Your mother always was too sentimental," he said, his eyes finding the open trapdoor. "I told her to burn that journal years ago. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Like the children you killed?" Sarah's voice cracked on the words. "Like the families you destroyed?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, Sarah. You can't understand. This town was dying before we came. People were leaving, businesses failing. We saved it. We gave it purpose. By feeding it children? By giving it what it needed." His voice hardened. "The thing beneath this town isn't evil, Sarah. It's ancient, powerful. It was here long before any of us, and it'll be here long after we're gone. We just learned how to work with it instead of against it." Sarah felt sick. Those children had families. They had lives ahead of them. And now the whole town prospers. Hundreds of families living good lives because of the choices we made. The mathematics are simple. A few lives to save many. "That's not mathematics," Sarah whispered. "That's murder." Thomas stepped closer, and Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. His eyes weren't quite right, the pupils too large, the irises shot through with threads of black that seemed to move in the dim light. Whatever bargain her family had made with the thing below, it had changed them in ways that went beyond moral corruption. "Your mother understood eventually," he continued. "She made her peace with it, and when the time came, she made her offering just like the rest of us." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What offering?" Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw that his teeth were wrong too. Too sharp, too numerous. "Why do you think she called you home, Sarah? Why do you think she left you the house? The thing below is hungry again. It's been 20 years since the last feeding, and it's growing restless. The dreams have started again. The nightmares are spreading." The baby kicked inside her, and Sarah felt a surge of protective fury that burned away her fear. "You're insane if you think I'll let you hurt my child." "Not your child," Thomas said softly. "You. The bloodline has to be maintained, but sacrifices must be made. Your mother chose you because you were already pregnant. One life to create another. It's poetic, really." Sarah's mind raced as the horrifying truth settled over her. Her mother hadn't left her the house out of love. She'd lured her here, pregnant and vulnerable, to be the next sacrifice. The journal wasn't a confession. It was an instruction manual, a way of ensuring Sarah understood her role in the family's monstrous legacy. But her mother had underestimated one thing. Sarah wasn't the frightened child who'd fled this house 20 years ago. She was a mother now, and that changed everything. The basement door slammed shut above them with a finality that made Sarah's heart stop. The sound of her mother's footsteps echoed overhead, followed by the unmistakable scraping of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah pressed her ear to the wooden steps, straining to hear what was happening above. "She's barricading us in," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with panic. "Sarah, we need to find another way out of here." But Sarah couldn't move. The revelation that her mother was still alive, that everything she'd believed about her death was a lie, had left her paralyzed with shock. The woman who had raised her, who had sung her lullabies and bandaged her scraped knees, had been keeping children prisoner in their basement for decades. "The journals," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "She wrote about the necessary sacrifices to keep our bloodline pure. Marcus, I think she's been—" She couldn't finish the sentence. A child's whimper drew their attention back to the corner where Tommy sat huddled against the wall. His eyes were wide with terror, and Sarah noticed fresh bruises on his thin arms. How long had he been down here? How many others had there been? The overhead light flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows across the concrete walls. In those shadows, Sarah began to notice things she'd missed before. Scratch marks near the base of the walls, stains on the floor that looked suspiciously dark, and worst of all, small items scattered in the corners. A child's shoe, a broken toy truck, a hair ribbon, faded and dirty. "Oh God," she breathed. "This has been going on for years." Marcus was systematically checking every inch of the basement walls, looking for any possible exit. There has to be another way out. Old houses like this often had multiple access points. His words were cut off by the sound of footsteps returning overhead. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to be moving in a pattern. Sarah realized with growing horror that her mother was performing some kind of ritual above them. "Sarah, my dear child," her mother's voice drifted down through the floorboards. "I know this is difficult to understand, but everything I've done has been for our family, for the continuation of our sacred bloodline." "You're insane!" Sarah shouted upward, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "These are innocent children." A low laugh echoed from above. "Innocent. They're chosen vessels, Sarah. Just as you were chosen, just as the child you carry has been chosen. The old ways must be preserved." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity, the isolated location of their house. Her mother's insistence that Sarah never bring friends home, the strange disappearances in town that had occurred throughout her childhood, disappearances she'd never connected to her own family. Marcus grabbed her arm gently. "Sarah, I found something." He led her to a section of the wall where the concrete looked newer than the rest. "This was patched recently. If we can break through—" But before he could finish, they heard the basement door opening again. Heavy footsteps descended the wooden stairs, and Sarah's mother appeared, but she looked different now. Gone was any pretense of maternal warmth. Her eyes held a cold, calculating gleam that made Sarah's blood run cold. In her hands, she carried an ornate silver knife that looked ancient and well used. "It's time, Sarah," she said, her voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "Time for you to understand your true purpose. The child you carry will be the next guardian of our sacred traditions." "Stay away from us," Marcus warned, positioning himself between Sarah and her mother. But the older woman just smiled. "You shouldn't have come here, young man. You've complicated things unnecessarily. But perhaps your presence is part of the grand design. Another sacrifice to ensure the ritual's power." Sarah felt the baby kick violently, as if sensing the danger surrounding them. She wrapped her arms protectively around her belly, backing toward the corner where Tommy cowered. "You killed Dad, didn't you?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "He found out what you were doing." Her mother's expression softened for just a moment, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine sorrow. "Your father lacked vision. He couldn't understand the importance of maintaining the old bloodlines, the old powers. He threatened to expose everything." The knife glinted in the dim light as her mother took another step forward. "But you, my darling Sarah, you have the gift. I've seen it in you since you were small. The same gift that runs through our maternal line. The gift that requires nourishment." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the full scope of her mother's madness. The gift she spoke of, the rituals, the children, it was all part of some twisted belief system that had been passed down through generations. And now her mother expected her to continue it. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Whatever it took, she would not let this cycle continue. The flames consumed the house with an almost supernatural hunger, orange tongues licking at the night sky, as if trying to devour the stars themselves. Sarah stood at the edge of the property line, one hand pressed protectively over her belly, watching 28 years of memories turn to ash and smoke. The fire department had arrived too late. She'd made sure of that, cutting the phone lines before dousing the basement in gasoline. Detective Morrison approached from behind, his footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. "The whole block's been evacuated. Are you certain there's no one else inside?" Sarah's laugh came out hollow, brittle. "Oh, there are others inside, but they've been dead for a very long time." The detective's radio crackled with updates from the fire chief. The basement was completely engulfed, the flames reaching temperatures hot enough to reduce bone to powder. Sarah closed her eyes and felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The 13 small skeletons, her mother's grotesque collection, would finally find peace. The ritual circle, carved with symbols that predated Christianity, would be destroyed. The altar where Margaret Hartwell had offered her own daughters to something ancient and hungry would crumble to dust. "Mrs. Chen, we're going to need a full statement about what happened here tonight." Sarah turned to face him, noting how the firelight cast shadows across his weathered features. "My mother was very ill, Detective. Sicker than any of us realized. What she did, what she kept hidden in that basement." She shook her head. "Some secrets are meant to burn." A section of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Sarah felt the baby kick, a strong, healthy movement that brought tears to her eyes. Throughout the ordeal in the basement, through her mother's final, desperate attempt to complete the ritual, the child had survived. More than survived, thrived, as if drawing strength from Sarah's determination to break the cycle. "We found records," Morrison said carefully. "Birth certificates, death certificates that were never filed. Your mother had other children, didn't she?" 13 daughters. The words came easier now, no longer carrying the weight of a shameful secret. She killed them, fed them to something she believed would grant her eternal life. "She thought I was going to help her finish what she started." The detective wrote furiously in his notepad, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his eyes. She didn't blame him. Who could believe such a story? Who would want to? "The medical examiner will need to go through the remains once the site cools down. This is going to be a long investigation, Mrs. Chen. Months, maybe years." Sarah nodded. She'd expected as much, but she also knew that modern forensics would only be able to make sense of so much. The ritual elements, the supernatural aspects of what her mother had done, those would be dismissed as delusions, the fantasies of a disturbed woman. The truth would be sanitized, made palatable for police reports and newspaper articles. Her phone buzzed. A text from David saw the news. "Flying back tonight. Are you okay?" Sarah typed back quickly. "Safe now. Coming home." Home. The word felt strange but good. Home wasn't this cursed plot of land where generations of Hartwell women had perpetuated a cycle of horror. Home was the small apartment she shared with David, the nursery they'd been preparing, the future they were building together. "I'll need to know where you'll be staying," Morrison said. "Seattle. I'm going back to Seattle tonight." Sarah looked at the burning house one last time. "There's nothing left for me here." As she walked toward her rental car, Sarah felt something shift in the air around her. The oppressive weight she'd carried since childhood, the sense of being watched by malevolent eyes, simply vanished. The entity her mother had served, whatever ancient hunger had demanded the sacrifice of innocent children, was gone. Cut off from its earthly anchor, banished back to whatever dark realm it had emerged from. The drive to the airport passed in a blur of streetlights and radio reports about the mysterious fire. Sarah kept one hand on her belly, feeling the steady rhythm of the baby's movements. She thought about names, normal, beautiful names that carried no family history, no connection to the Hartwell legacy. At the airport, as she waited for her red-eye flight, Sarah bought a small notebook and began to write. Not the whole truth, That would die with her, but enough of it to serve as a warning. If anyone ever discovered who she really was, if they ever came looking for the Hartwell bloodline, they would find only this record of horror and the choice to end it. The plane lifted off just as dawn broke over the horizon. Below, a thin column of smoke still rose from the ruins of her childhood home. Sarah pressed her face to the window and whispered a prayer for her 13 sisters, finally free to rest in peace.